You don't hear a lot of pictures.
It's not that I know of.
My daddy's grandma was Minnie. She was one of like 7 girls. Remember the Bessie, remember Nessie, the Viola, and Patty. Like Emma, it's like we're gonna run out of names.
Should spell Minnie's and M-A.
Minnie?
Minnie. Said Minnie. Said Minnie daughters.
Oh.
That may be the average. That's hard.
Yeah, but short.
We're just calling it lady, so I.
Ain't the. But she told me her pay, I would give them a fix.
God, she would have got a lot of Andy Griffith jokes though. And
now, way back in my family, like in the 1700s, we had family members that were named Anne. Their nickname was Nancy.
yeah. Well, and I heard Dan apparently is Anne. So I guess if you took that and Anne and made it Nancy, I guess.
And around that same time, I had Talika, like a Tabitha with an L, Talika, and Jemima.
Yeah.
And these were white people.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was like all my daddy's brothers and sisters, 7. He was 8, he was 7. And they gave all of those people, brothers and sisters, and nicknames.
My dad had a uncle named Matron. He was not in the services. His name was Matron. No. So I have pictures of them when they were little kids. And I took it to where I worked one day, and he just looked at it and we put it to Bo Major. We said, "Does that man, he passed away, he's alive?" Yeah, he's alive. So does he have mental problems? And I'm thinking, why do you ask? He said he has a very high, prominent, bulging forehead, and that usually comes with. I said, no, all Americans have big heads.
Right. I guess. Somebody posted on Twitter today a picture of Adolis Garcia, the Rangers, and they were talking to him, and he showed his picture, he wasn't wearing his cap. And I don't know what's going on with his head. It looks like his head is swollen. So I started thinking he's taking a gigantism inducing drugs over the off season or something. It's pretty evident.
Mom, that is yeah, the school out here. Oh, strange. Yes.
It's called that stuff.
Texas. I used to go down and jump in. Yeah. That's what I was at 9, and he said, "Well, they got a dusty." So then when he heard Dad was going to the school, he said, "For some sweaters." So I wanted to say, "Well,
What other places?
it's not Texas."
Let's see.
Coworker there said, "Yeah, they got it, but it caught."
Where my son lives, one of them told me, I don't know whether it's them, the neighbors will see it a lot.
Just that coworker is also going to the Bahamas or on that Tulsa job, and they got to Dallas and on the plane, and they were stuck. There because you saw snow and ice. I said,
I guess we're ready. Let's go ahead and get started. We are in lesson 7 of the Psalms. We're going to be talking about the Psalms of David. And I think, I don't, I kind of feel like we're not going to get through all this today. We may do some of this today, tonight, and save some of it for next week. And we're going to be doing a lot of Psalm reading because I think that'll be useful, especially in looking at some of the historical things. And there are some things I think that are worth talking about. Some of these psalms that I don't want to just kind of glide past without at least talking about them a little bit. So um, we talked last week about the Lord is my shepherd is kind of I guess obviously David's most famous of the psalms, and talked about some of his background as a shepherd and how that clearly bled into his writing. It gave him experience, and he wrote about what he knew and wrote about what he had seen, and how that reflected his relationship to God, and how uh, what our relationship to God is. And so what we see is, I forget exactly the number of psalms that are accredited to David in one way or the other. It's worth noting, by the way, that as he said in the book, when it says a psalm of David, that can mean some different things. It could mean David wrote it. It's about David. It was written for David. There's different ways that it could be. There's the assumption that a lot of them probably were written, if not all of them, were written by David. Not all the psalms were written by David, but a lot of them were. And also these specific ones that we may look at today at some point: Psalm 110, Psalm 69, Psalm 16, Psalm 2, Psalm 11. I put an asterisk by that because I'm not. It's not 100% sure, but Psalm 32 and Psalm 3. When you go to the New Testament, they are specifically attributed to David. So the apostles and Jesus said David wrote these, and so that clearly indicates that he did. So there's a lot of things that he wrote, and as it talks about in the book, a lot of the writings that you see are linked specifically to incidents in his life. And I wanted to go through some of these and look at them, because I think that gives us some things I think that are worth looking at and connections to make. The first one that he mentions in here is in Psalm chapter 7, or Psalm chapter 7, in the 7th Psalm. Trying to get out of the habit of saying that, but I still do it. In Psalm 7, this is a psalm that was written, as it says, which he sang to the Lord concerning the words of Cush, a Benjamite. And nobody knows who, a Benjaminite, I should say. And nobody knows who this is. Cush is not mentioned specifically by name anywhere. But what do we know about the tribe of Benjamin that might explain some of this? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it's the tribe of Saul. And so what you see is a number of examples that are written in First and Second Samuel's First and Second Samuel, where the Benjaminites don't always. It takes a little bit to get them on board with David as king, because obviously these are Saul's kin, these are his people. And if you remember, there's one particular person, if you remember, that we read about in Second Samuel from the tribe of Benjamin. Do you remember his name? It's from later on in David's realm, or in David's reign. You may not remember his name, but you may remember the story. Yeah, Shimei. He was the guy, if you remember, that when Absalom is taking over the kingdom, David and his men and his people kind of sneak out of Jerusalem before Absalom and his armies can get there. And as they're leaving, Shimei, who is a Benjamite, starts running along next to the army and shouting and cursing and throwing rocks and throwing dirt, and basically calling David a man of blood, and that all the things that he's done have come back on him. And the indication there is that you don't belong on the throne. You took the throne from Saul. Now, of course, the problem with that is that why was Saul no longer king? Well, that's true. But from a very practical standpoint, why did Saul stop being king? Well, yeah, he was killed. Not all those are right, but from a very basic standpoint, he just got killed, and it wasn't David that did it. He died fighting the Philistines. If you remember, David had nothing to do with that, and yet you're still going to see Saul's relatives. Maybe it's because they felt like, well, we know that after Saul died, there was a man named Adonijah who was one of his sons that uh, Abner, the general of the armies, tried to install as king. And so you had a transitional period, if you were, where David was ruler in Judah, but Saul's descendants were still reigning in parts of Israel. And you start to get into all the conflicts that go as a result of that. There was a lot of deaths that took place. If you remember, there was a story of Abner and Joab, who was David's general, fighting together at the beginning of Second Samuel, trying to establish who's going to be king. And so you've got Israelites killing each other until they finally are able to stop it. But it specifically mentions the tribe of Benjamin as being involved in this down in it was in Second Samuel 2. It's the story where you got Joab on one side of the creek and Abner on the other side, and they basically said, "All right, let's go." And they just send down, you send some, I'll send some, and we'll just see what happens. And specifically, we read about 12 men of the tribe of Benjamin fighting on Abner's behalf. And so there's clearly a lot of issues where Benjamin was slow to accept David. And so I always wondered, there may have been something specifically regarding a man named Cush that was in some of the stories that we read that we're not told about. But ultimately, whatever it is here's a man who is holding a grudge against David and attempting to undermine him. And so let's look at what it says in Psalm 7. Psalm 7, beginning in verse 1. Uh, yeah, sure. You want to read? Okay, go ahead.
O Lord my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, lest like a lion they tear my soul apart, rending it in pieces with none to deliver. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is wrong in my hands, if I have repaid my friend with evil, or plundered my enemy without cause, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it. Let him trample my life to the ground and lay my glory in the dust. Arise, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up against the fury of my enemies. Awake for me. You have appointed a judgment. Let the assembly of the peoples be gathered about me. Over it return on high. The Lord judges the peoples. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity that is in me. O let the evil of the wicked come to an end, and may you establish the righteous, you who test the minds and hearts, O righteous God. My shield is with God, who saves the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge, and a God who feels indignation every day. If man does not repent, God will whet his sword. He has bent and readied the bow. He has prepared for him his deadly weapons, making his arrows fiery shafts. Behold, the wicked man conceives evil and is pregnant with mischief and gives birth to lies. He makes a pit, digging it out, and falls into the hole that he has made. His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his own skull his violence descends. I will give the Lord the thanks due his righteousness, and I will sing praise to the name of the Lord, the Most High.
So as you're reading this or listening to this and describing the attitude of this psalm, how do you describe what David is saying here? What is his attitude in approaching God? Yeah. If I Now, what's the implication of what David believes in this? Yeah, he's not guilty. It's not necessarily a look. I don't know, God. You be the judge. This is I'm confident in what I've done, and I'm standing before God, saying, Lord, if you see something in me, and he says this on a number of occasions, if I have reason for this man to hate me or to try to undermine me or these people to wrong me in some way, uh, then judge me accordingly. And it's interesting to me. This is one of those passages that you always wonder if this was written early on, if this is something that David would have written later in his life. Because when he describes himself, and he does this on a number of instances, when he talks about being judged, he talks about let's see, maybe I'm thinking of another passage, but it talks about in verse 8, where it says, "The Lord judges the people. Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity that is in me." And we read that and we think, well, you know, I don't know that David was that righteous. He did a lot of bad things. But how do we reconcile that? How does David, someone who was clearly not perfect. He clearly made plenty of mistakes, and yet he's able to stand before God saying, God, judge me according to my righteousness. How does that work? Okay. Okay. hmm He, yeah, the idea that when he did sin, he repented. Whether this was before or after Uriah, don't really know. And to your point, I don't know that it makes a lot of difference. But the idea that he was in good standing with God and he knew that to be the case.
Well, in verse 12, he says, if man does not repent, when he is bent and ready to go. So he knows what is due him
Mhm.
if he is not righteous,
Mhm.
which is why he repents.
Yeah. And so he makes that point. Yeah, I like verse 4 was kind of interesting. He says that in verse 4, if I've repaid my friend with evil or plundered my enemy without cause. I always wonder, when we read about David's life, uh, especially his early days when he's running from the law, running from Saul, and he's basically breaking up with a band of bandits running around. He's literally making his living by going in and looting some of the surrounding areas of the Canaanites and the Philistines in that area. So it kind of struck me when he said, if I've looted my enemy without cause, and as I think about what does that imply? Why is David attacking these surrounding cities? Well, he had cause. What kind of cause might he have? There's some of that probably. Remember what's going on here. Why are those why are those cities with Canaanites and Philistines in the area to begin with?
Because they failed to remove them when God told them to.
Yeah, they're not supposed to be here anyway. God told him to get rid of these people. Uh, and so, in a lot of ways, David is doing essentially what God had given them already permission to do, which is to drive them out. And so that's what he's doing. In addition to that, as you mentioned, uh, these are armies that are cities or nations that are in many cases already at war with Israel to begin with, especially the Philistines. So it's not simply a case where David's riding around with his men and he sees an innocent settlement over there. Hey, let's go take all their stuff. And in fact, he says that very clearly. If I'm going around just killing innocent people for no reason other than my own greed, then judge me accordingly. So I thought that was useful to keep in mind when we read some of the stories about David later on. It's one of the values I think of these songs about David is they give us a little context to some of the things that he does and help us to understand his mindset. Because there's times when we read, the kings, the writers of Samuel and Kings don't necessarily try to give us a window into the mindset of those people. They just say, this is what they did, this is what happened. And so we don't always see David doing things that seem at the time to be motivated by a desire to serve God. And yet, what we see here in Psalm 7 is in all the things that I've been doing. I've been keeping God in my mind and trying to do my best to be right and justified before God. And I think that's one of the things that at some point, maybe it's because once the gospel, we believe that things work differently in the Old Testament than they do under Christ, and there's a sense in which they do. But David could stand and say, judge me according to my righteousness. If I were to say that in 95% of the churches or quote unquote Christian churches in the world today, what would they say? You can't say that. Nobody's justified by their righteousness. Nobody.
In yourself.
Yeah, you're boasting in yourself. You're talking about how good you are, and it's worth noting again that that's not how David saw it, and he's saying this not because he's boastful, not because he's saying, "Look what a wonderful person I am," but I think specifically in this case, these people are going against me because they're accusing me of being this kind of a person. And I know to God, and I can stand before God and say with all honesty and with all openness, what they're saying about me is a lie. And so there's a sense in which there's a context involved here. I can stand before God and say I'm righteous before God. That doesn't mean I haven't sinned. But when we talk about the difference between someone who is blameless and someone who is sinless, that's when we talk about an elder who needs to be blameless. What do we mean by an elder being blameless?
If there were wrongs, it's rectified.
Okay. Okay. there's nothing that somebody's going to come and hold to his account and say, look, this guy just, look at all the things he's done or whatever it might be. It has nothing to do with, well, I know for a fact that he's not perfect, but here's somebody who has something to his charge that has not been dealt with. And of course, we know if we get into the elders discussion, sometimes that's kind of how that gets translated. But so David is willing to stand up and say, I'm righteous before God. And it's a great example of having how to take the Psalms in their context, because later on we're going to read passages where he's going to say the exact opposite of this. And the answer to that, of course, is, well, he's talking about a different thing. And frankly, there's days when I feel pretty good about how I'm doing with God. And there's days when I don't feel very good at all about how I'm doing with God. And that's the great thing about the Psalms, is that they give us they don't give us a one-dimensional or two-dimensional person. They show someone in the peaks and in the valleys, someone who is doing really well and somebody who's struggling. And we see all of those things in David. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say in that. Anything else that you wanted to talk about out of that passage? I will say the idea of, in verse 8, he mentions the integrity that is in me. We talked about this on my online leadership class last week, and that idea of integrity. What does integrity mean? What does it mean to have integrity?
It's kind of what we're talking about with the elder just a minute ago. It's above reproach.
Okay.
Their words bond.
Okay.
They've been shown to be faithful to what they say.
Okay. When we talk about a building or a structure having integrity, what do we mean? Solid, consistent. It doesn't have like little weaknesses here and there. Yeah, it's built firmly. It's resolute. It's not something that if something has integrity, I'm not going to be able to go up and down it until I find that weak spot, and it is consistent across. And that's kind of how I always think of someone who has integrity, someone who's consistent of character, someone who is the same with you as they are with me. They're the same by themselves as they are in a big group or in a one-on-one. They are who they are, and they maintain that consistency. I don't know that you can be consistently bad. I don't think I would call that integrity. But the idea is that I have consistently strong character in all contexts, and that's who David tried to be. He didn't always succeed, but that's what he strove to be, and he was probably that a lot more than we give him credit for, and probably more than a lot of us would be in very difficult situations. So, with that, look over Psalm 18. This is kind of a similar. It skips ahead, and I'm not totally sure whether this is intended to have been written. The notation is to the choir master, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who addressed the words of the song to the Lord on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. I don't know if this means, this is written in 2 Samuel 22 towards the end of David's life. I'm not sure if that's when he wrote this or said this, or if it was really more related to when he actually became king. But regardless, he describes how God has been with him and God has brought him to the point where he is. And let's see, it's a pretty long. So we're not going to read this one, but there's some things that are some language that I think is good to look at, especially in the beginning where we'll recognize the words here. I think when he says in verse 2, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverance, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, and I'm saved from my enemies. Any of us have been to camp know this passage pretty well. He talks about the idea, as he says in verse 4, the cords of death encompass me, the torrents of destruction assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me, and the snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. To my God, I cried for help. From his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. I don't know. I don't know whether this is intended to be messianic in nature. You could probably argue that maybe it is, but he's making some descriptions in verse 4 and 5 about, I was at death's door. Death had a hold of me and was dragging me down, and I was crying out for mercy for God to God, and God heard. And it's interesting when you read I always think this is a good example of apocalyptic language, if you will, because he starts talking about the earth reeling and rocking, smoke from his nostrils, glowing coals, darkness is covering, all this dramatic language of God coming to David's defense. And the thing I always think about is, well, at what point in David's life do we ever see anything even remotely like that? And as far as I know, we never do. If it was, it was never written that way. Well, what we do see is David triumphing over his enemies. And so the idea that David, in dramatic and poetic form, showing how God's power and God's righteousness and God's judgment is revealed through the fact that at the end of the day, David is delivered from the hardship and from the dangers and from the potential death that he was faced with. And I like the thing about this, and again, by the way, in verse 20, he echoes what we've already read because he says, "The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he rewarded me. For I've kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. All his rules were before me, and his statutes I did not put away from me. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt." Verse 22, I think, is kind of useful, and maybe this helps us to understand David, and hopefully maybe we see a little bit of this in ourselves. I feel like I see some of this in myself sometimes too. He says, "All his rules were before me, and his statutes I did not put away from me." Here- When we think about our lives and when the times that we've sinned, do we ever feel like there was a time where I just said, "You know what? I'm not listening to this. The Bible's going over there. I'm ignoring the Bible. I'm not interested in this anymore. I'm going to do what I want to do." Hopefully not. Uh, you know, I'd like to think on my worst day, if that happens, it's very temporary. But the idea is that even on days when I stumble and struggle with that, is there ever a time when I don't care. I don't care. Am I ever not bothered by my sin? Am I ever bothered by the fact that I'm doing something that I know I shouldn't be doing? Hopefully not. And there's that idea that it says his laws are always before me. And in fact, even at the end, when the last thing we read about with David in 2 Samuel, when he declares the census, and which was sinful. Before Nathan even comes to him, we read that David's heart pricked him. As he's doing this, he realizes, I shouldn't be doing this. So David never drifted away from the law. He always had it in front of him. He always kept it. And when he slipped and fell, he was eager to get back. And that's when we think about his righteousness and the cleanness of his hands and why he could be considered that. It's that at the end of the day, he never turned his back on who God wanted him to be. Which is what made him great. And it says that the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness. And again, there's that same language. The idea that something that we would never say today that what do you, wait a second, you're saying God rewarded you for being righteous? That means you earned salvation. That what does that mean? And we don't want to use that kind of language, but that's how David describes it here. And that's the kind of relationship that he had with God. Let's see if there's something else I want to bring up in this section.
21.
Mhm.
As far as kept quiet with the Lord that wicked.
Mhm. Yeah,
In saying that part God had done it wicked.
yeah,
I think that's we need to think about we slip. We slip and fall, we slip and sin. We didn't do it because we were wicked.
Mhm.
Wasn't wicked. We just fell.
Mhm. Yeah,
Hey,
yeah, absolutely.
It's the contrast when people say that God's not there for them, or they decided not to do that, it's because what they want to do is more important. It's like when Tad told me, I prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed for God to take these urges away from me. But he was still going on the internet and looking at stuff.
Yeah,
Talking to homosexual people. And so, yeah, he wasn't cutting himself off from what he wanted to do,
yeah,
even though he was quote unquote praying.
yeah, yeah. You can't. It doesn't really do a whole lot of good to ask God to stop you from doing the thing that you're intending to do anyway. And I think that's when something that jumped out to me in this psalm. It's kind of on the other side of that, but it's kind of the same idea. In verse 39, he's describing his work as a soldier and his success over his enemies. In fact, back up to verse 37, where it says, well, actually, you know what? Let's back up. Back up to 33. He made my feet like the feet of a deer, set me secure on the heights. He trains my hand for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You've given me a shield of your salvation. Your right hand supported me, and your gentleness made me great. You gave me a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. And then in verse 37, it kind of shifts a little bit. He said, I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and did not turn back till they were consumed. I thrust them through so that they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. For you equipped me with the strength for the battle, and made those who rise against me sink under me. And he talks about beating them into fine dust in verse 42. And when we think about how he's describing, David talks about two aspects of his victories. And the first one is the idea that, or one of them is the idea to look at all the things I was able to do. I chased my enemies. I beat them down. I defeated everybody. I was powerful, and I did all these things. But why was he able to do those things? Yeah, because God trained him, because God gave him the ability and the opportunity and the strength to do all of those things. And I think that's an important point, especially again, as we think about today and how God strengthens us. David is not shy about saying, I went and did these things. But he always makes the point of saying, I did them with the strength and the abilities and the tools that God supplied to me. And I think there's a lot of examples when we want to learn about faith and works and how those things work and how God supplies and what it means for me to follow God. There's things that I'm called to do, and I can go do them. God doesn't give me gifts and say, all right, now you can just sit idly and not do anything. I'm going to do it all for you. David had to go take the cities. He had to go put himself at risk. In fact, at one point, he put himself in so much risk as he was getting older. His soldiers finally had to say, look, you're not going out to war anymore. You are the light of Israel. We can't afford to have you killed. You stay at home now. We'll take care of all this. So David was never someone that said, God has blessed me, and I don't need to do anything at this point to earn anything, or not earn necessarily, but to go fulfill what God has told me to do. Uh, he always had the approach that God expects me to go and do the work and do what He's called me to do. But He always does that with the intent on glorifying God, and I think that's what this psalm is about.
Was taught that, because sometimes you see him when he goes out with Goliath. Sometimes he says, I have not tested these, but my God has fought for me every time. So he knew where his strength came from.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts on this one? We kind of skimmed through this one, but it's a long one, so I didn't want to spend too much time on it. Let me look at this real quick here. Yeah, 34. Something about 34 was interesting to me. Psalm 34. There's two psalms that appear to be that are focused on David's time with the Philistines, which is one of the most, as you read the story of David, one of the more confusing series of stories that we find. David is going to actually go and ally himself with the leaders, the Philistines, who are at war with Israel, and he actually aligns himself up. At one point, he's even volunteering to go and fight with them against Israel. And there's all kinds of discussion about what this meant, and surely David wasn't really serious about that, and we don't really know. But it's difficult to figure out how David would align himself with these people. But there's a couple of psalms here that I think are useful. In Psalm 34, it says when he actually, you know what? Let's do the first one first. Let's go to let's talk about 56. Psalm 56 first. Let's do that one first. This is what David, in looking back and how he praises God in the situation that he was in. The Philistines, if you remember, he's been in the area. He's been raiding camps in the area and doing things, and he's kind of endeared himself to the Philistine king. And some of the Philistine armies or generals or leaders or whatever find out who David is, and they go to Abimelech and say, "Look, this is the guy that the people of Israel sing songs about." He's the one that sings, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000. This is not, why do we want to trust? Why would you ever want to trust this guy? And if you remember, how does David get out of that situation? You remember? He, he does something really weird. Let's go read the story. Let's go to 1 Samuel 21. 1 Samuel 21. This is the time, of course, if you remember, David is on the run from Saul to the point where he literally had to leave Israel because Saul is trying to kill him. Whether he should have done that or not is a question that we would talk about if we were going to study this passage. I'm not going to worry about it right now, but during this time, let's see. Yeah, in verse 10. It says, David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in his dances? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. By the way, do you notice they call him David, king of the land? Everybody knew that David had been anointed king at this point. I remember when Abigail, if you remember the story of Abigail and Nabal, when Abigail has to come out and keep David from coming in and wiping out their entire village because Nabal is a fool, essentially. And she tells David, look, now when you are king of Israel and God has done all the things that he has promised you to do, you don't want it on your conscience that you killed all these innocent people. And it's a reminder that everybody knew that Samuel had anointed David king. They all knew who he was. They all knew what God had promised him. And maybe that helps us to understand Saul's actions a little bit more and why he was so adamant that despite the fact that David keeps saying, look, I will not raise my hand against the king, Saul still was consumed with jealousy over this. And even his enemies here, even the Philistines, isn't David the king? Um, and so it says in verse 12 that David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And so he changed his behavior before him and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate, let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to the servants, Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? Uh, as a result of that, then they let him go because basically he's tried to act in a way that this guy's crazy. He's of no consequence. Why are you bothering me with this? And so he's able to escape. And David writes about that in both of these psalms. Let's look at we were in, was it 51, 56? Yeah, thank you. I kind of got them mixed around in my notes. Oh, okay. So they've seized him. And now David writes about this in retrospect. And if there was any question, you might read this part of David's life in First Samuel and go, it feels like Samuel's just kind of David just kind of turned his back on God. He's turned his back on his people. But this is what he was thinking during that time. It says in verse 1, Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me all day, and an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape. In wrath cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you, for you have delivered my soul from death. Yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. You know, when you think about David and what he was going through, he had just got finished for the second time he'd gone to Saul. I believe this is right. This is after the second time, and finally he has to say that he tells Saul and his army, "Look, do you realize you're cutting me off from my people, from Israel? I can't even be in the presence of my God in the tabernacle because I can't be here because you have made me an enemy of this nation. You're forcing me to leave." And I wonder sometimes if David at this point feels to some degree cut off from God because he's cut off from God's people. And so he leaves and he goes to be with the Philistines, and now the Philistines are trying to undermine him. And you start to wonder, David's thinking, how do I get a break here? The Israelites hate me, and now the Philistines are trying to undermine me. I can't. Where can I go that I'm not going to have people trying to undermine me and eventually get me killed? Uh, and here he reminds us that his trust ultimately was in God and that God had redeemed him. He's seen it's David acknowledging that God has seen all that I've been going through and all the difficulties in my life, and God has taken care of me. And even though he was still cast away, he was still alienated from his people, but he was able to see God's redemption, and he was able to see God's protection. And as he says in verse 12, I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you, understanding that God had done these things for him. Now I'll go back to the other one, which is Psalm 34, where it specifically mentions him feigning madness before the king. And it's basically a psalm of thanksgiving. It's a psalm of blessing and describing it. This is where we get in verse 8, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that takes refuge in him. Fear the Lord, you his saints, for those who fear him have no lack. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but for those who seek the Lord lack no good thing." The idea of, again, here's somebody who's on the run for his life, and yet he's able to say, God has given me everything that I need, that God has protected me through all of these things. And again, let's see if there's anything else specifically I want to bring up. In verse 21, as he closes this out, he says, "Afflictions will slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned." And, and again, this is an example of David coming up with an idea to get away from those who were attempting to kill him. And yet he still praises God for this. Because ultimately, who is it that allows him to escape? Who is it that has control over all these things? And he makes the argument that it is God. I came up with this crazy idea to make myself look insane, but ultimately it works because God is with me. Uh, let's see. I'm not going to go down this road. I thought about there's something kind of interesting about this, but I may do a lesson about it at some point down the road, and we'll talk about it. But be on the lookout as you're reading these. Hopefully you got a chance to read most of these, or if you go back and read them in retrospect. There's a lot of instances where I've been reading these and I'm thinking to myself, this is starting to look a lot. There's some similarities here and there that are pointing me back towards the life, or forward towards the life of Christ. There's some things in here of David's story that maybe you don't think about it, but as you read them more and more, and I guess I will say it because I'm on this road. David is brought before this Gentile king, and the reason that the king finally decides to let him go is because he looks at David and sees him no longer as a threat to him. And we think about what happens with Jesus, which is essentially the same thing. Uh, Pilate lets him go. Why? Because find no fault in him. The thing that Jesus says to him that really prompts all of this is when Pilate asks him, "Are you king?" And what does he answer? "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my servants would fight." And Pilate's looking at this guy going, "This is not much of a king. He's a king, but he doesn't have an army. He's apparently doesn't think that he needs an army. I don't know, why are we wasting our time with this?" And so he goes back to the people and says, "Why did you even bring him here? I don't, this is not my." And it reminded me a little bit of the passage where it talks about. Let's see, where did I write it down? In Isaiah 52, right before the passage in 53 that we always quote, where it says in verse 14, as many as were astonished at you. His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. In other words, we looked at him, and and I guess the thing that jumped out at me, and the reason I thought about this was because in both the notes in the Psalms and in First Samuel, when it describes this, it says that David changed his appearance. In other words, made himself to look a way that is just, I don't know if you'd call it off-putting, or certainly something that would look at somebody and discredit them. He made himself to look of no report, if you will. It just sounds a lot like the idea that the Philistine king is looking at David and seeing him in the same way that the Psalms say or Isaiah says they're going to see Jesus, someone who's a madman, someone who is of no consequence. He's not worth our trouble. He's not somebody that we would ever look at and say, "Here, this person's a threat to us." It just occurred to me that there were some connections there that I think it's not a strong connection, but the idea that he was worthless in the eyes of the Philistines, and he allowed himself to be seen as worthless in the eyes of the Philistines, so that God could redeem him and God could use him for what he was purposed to do. So that's just some thoughts. Let's look at one more tonight, because I know we're running out of time, and I'll use this as our invitation. Yeah, let's look at Psalm 51. Psalm 51 is, of course, the psalm that describes David's mindset or his thoughts when he's been confronted by Nathan after having slept with Bathsheba, having had Uriah the Hittite killed. And now he is calling out to God. And it says in verse 1, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. Against you and only you have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth and in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your way, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue shall sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering, the sacrifice of God, or a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then will you delight in right sacrifices, and burnt offerings, and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. A lot of times I think when we think about confessions and our attitudes in confession, have you ever known anybody that covered up their sin for a long time. And they denied it for a long time until finally they were presented with undeniable evidence and exposed for exactly what they did. And they turn at that point and yeah, I did it. And they repent. How do we typically look at that? I mean, I know in my case, my tendency is to think, look, the only reason you said that, the only reason you're repenting at all, the only reason you're confessing is you had no alternative because you were called out on it and now you have to. That's not really being sorry. But then I guess then you start thinking about David. And maybe this is one of the reasons this story is in here. Because when we think about David and his attitude and how long, we don't know how long he kept this secret. And you could easily say, look, David would have kept it forever. He would have gone to the grave unless Nathan had come and confronted him with it. And maybe that's true. And maybe it's there to remind us of why sin is so dangerous for us. Because what becomes very clear is that if I were to judge David in that regard, I would have been very wrong about the state of his heart. And when we think about why David couldn't confess, was it pride? I suspect maybe it was that. Maybe it was more just the horror of what I have done. How can I even, what do I do at this point? Where, at some point, it's almost as if you've ever done anything like this where you think to yourself, this is just, how did I get myself into this? What can I possibly say to make this better? How can I possibly, I'm going to lose everything. My life is going to be over if I acknowledge what I have done. We think to that person, well, yeah, but you got to do it. Well, and that's right. But you look at how David describes his life and his attitude. It reminds me so much of when Paul was talking about his life or the hypothetical life under the law, when he says, "A wretched man that I am, who will save me from this body of death?" I want to do good, and I keep doing bad, and it's eating me up inside. And that's what we just when David writes this, and he talks about how he says, "Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my." The idea that I can't feel joy in my life while this is going on. And he wants to repent, but he just doesn't know how to do it until Nathan says, "You're the man." It's at that point when David confesses everything. And we're going to see later on, well, not later on, it's in, which one is it? Where he says, "Blessed is the man to whom God has not imputed iniquity." We see the opposite. We see him coming out of this side of repentance. In fact, I think it is in. Let me double check and see. I believe it's in. So I'm probably going to be completely wrong. Well, I won't find it because I know we're running out of time. He talks about the blessings of someone who's been forgiven for what they've done. And David is just, as he describes this, he uses some language here that's very easy to misinterpret. He says, "Against you and only you have I sinned." You think to yourself, wait a second. I think he sinned against Uriah. I think he sinned against Bathsheba. I think he sinned against everybody that he lied about. Why does David say this? And I think the point he's trying to make is that in understanding the severity of what I have done, it's not that these sins are simply at the root of all this, what's happened? I violated my covenant with God. When he says, "You only have I sinned," the point being that you're the one that this matters to me. You're the one that I want to restore my relationship with. And he says, as he says, "Against you only have I sinned, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment." In other words, I want to make sure that everybody understands that what I did was wrong because it was in violation of what you have called me to be. so that everyone will understand that. But when David the king, you can imagine what the talk was going around the castle. Psalm 32, that's the one. Thank you. Everybody knew. You don't keep secrets in castles from everything I've ever heard in palaces. Everybody knows. Bathsheba just shows up after Uriah dies and she's pregnant. You can imagine what's being talked about. Here's David. He's a man after God's own heart, and look what he did. It's almost as if David is saying, I want to make sure everybody understands that you are righteous and that my unrighteousness, my sin, uh, should not be cast against God. So that as he says, you will be blameless in your judgment. It's kind of like um, when when God confronts Job in Job 40, he says, will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? In other words, are you going to call God into question to justify yourself and justify your own view of the life? David says, I don't want that to be the case. I want everybody to understand that God is right and that I'm wrong. And so he gives this attitude of confession and of remorse. And as you mentioned in Psalm 32, where we see his attitude in having been forgiven and having been cleansed. And he says, blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, in whose spirit there is no deceit. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up by the heat of the summer. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you in a time when you may be found. Those are great words of comfort. Understanding and remembering that, there's not a whole lot I can do in my life that would be much worse than anything that David did. And yet David was forgiven because he truly sought God with all his heart. And so let's remember that as we think about our own relationship to God, as we look at these Psalms and we read, maybe we've never done anything to that extent or to the degree that David did. But we always know that God's merciful to us if we're willing to turn ourselves back to God. I kept thinking I was gonna come up with a good psalm, an evening prayer. Which one is that? I'm sorry. What's the number though? 106. Okay. I kept thinking to myself, I'm gonna think of a song that's gonna be exactly right out of one of these psalms, and it didn't click for me. So, but 106, I think is a great example and a great way to close. So we'll sing our closing song. Is there any prayers, anybody that we need to be remembering that we want to bring up tonight that we don't already know about? Judy, I assume, is still not feeling kind of down, but maybe not too down because Mark was able to be here for a little bit. Um, Jim and Judy, are they traveling? Are they just not? They're just home. It's dark. Sue, I know, is home because of the cold, I'm sure. Yeah. Uh, Other than that, I don't know of anybody particular. Just remember our fourth Sunday is coming up this Sunday. Looking forward to have Jeremy here. So we're planning on that. Let's sing then number 106. And then, David, if you would lead us in closing prayer. If I have wounded any soul today, if I have caused his foot to go astray, if I have walked in my own willful way, dear Lord, forgive. If I have uttered idle words of vain, if I have caught a sign from want or pain, lest I myself shall suffer through the strain, dear Lord, forgive the sins I have confessed to thee. Forgive thy secret sins I do not see. O God, my love me and my keeper be. In Jesus' name.
Our God and our Father, we thank you for a beautiful day. Although it's cold, we thank you, Father, and that we have together. I ask that you help us take these lessons to heart. Help us, Father, to live our lives in accordance to your word. Help our lives be a reflection of Christ. Let encourage others to come to you. Thank you, Father, for helping those who are down, needing strength. We ask that you would help them to heal. Thank you for those, Father, who are homebound, and ask that you be with them. Thank you, Father, for your love, for your forgiveness, for your strength and your salvation. Pray, Father, that we may never take for granted what we have in Christ Jesus. Oh, Father, that he bore our iniquities. He took them to the cross with him. He suffered our shame and iniquity, and gave us a way of salvation which we would not have. Thank you, Father, that the blood of Christ is cleansing power. Pray that each and every one that have baptized in Christ will remember who shed that blood for us of being there. Forgive us, Father, walk with us and help us be the people that we should be. I ask